The Ballad of Preston Mayeux, the hallowed descent of Mark Mayeux. The moon hung like a pale ghost in the obsidian sky as Mark Mayeux and his faithful sidekick, Blake Mata, trudged through the dense, blood-soaked jungle of Zimbabwe. Their armor, chipped and worn from previous skirmishes, rattled softly with every step. The air was thick with humidity and the stench of death, a reminder that the jungle itself had long turned against the living. "This gold, it's cursed, Mark," Blake muttered, eyes scanning the surroundings with unease. "Ain't no fortune worth this madness." Mark, his expression grim, clutched the hilt of his sword tighter. His past was a tapestry of loss and regret, but gold, true gold, could change all that. He wasn't about to back down now. "We're here for a reason, Blake. We can't turn back. Not now." Blake grunted, but said nothing more. They pushed forward, deeper into the jungle, until they reached the ancient temple that lay half buried under a blanket of vines. There, in the heart of the temple, the fabled golden Floyd lay, its glimmer hidden beneath the crumbling stone floor. But as they entered the cavernous interior, the air shifted. It grew thick with an unnatural chill, a shadow darker than night itself coiling around their feet. Mark felt it first, a cold, unnatural presence. Before he could warn Blake, the ground began to tremble. A guttural screech echoed from the depths of the temple. Blake spun around, his hand darting for his crossbow. Mark's sword was already drawn, his muscles tensing in anticipation. Then they came. The baboons, monstrous and twisted, their eyes gleaming red like embers in a hellish fire, surged from the darkness. Their fur was matted and stained, and their claws were sharp enough to tear through steel. Their screeches were a cacophony of madness as they lunged at the two men. Blake let loose a bolt, skewering one of the beasts through its heart, but for every baboon they slew, 10 more seemed to rise from the darkness. It was an endless wave of carnage. Mark fought with relentless fury, his sword slicing through the air, cutting down beasts left and right, but their numbers were too great. "We can't hold them off," Blake shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Mark's eyes flicked to the altar where the gold lay. It gleamed, almost mocking them. "We must reach the altar, Blake. Only then will the path forward open." But just as they surged toward the altar, the ground cracked open beneath them. From the shadows above, a figure appeared, tall, dark, and draped in robes as black as the void. Her eyes, glowing with a cruel malice, locked onto Mark and Blake. Ariel Mack, the sorceress who had cursed these lands. "Foolish mortals," she intoned, her voice like the whisper of death itself. "You dare trespass into my domain, seeking the treasures that are not meant for you? Now, you shall pay the price." With a flick of her wrist, dark tendrils of magic snaked out, binding Mark and Blake in place. The baboons halted, as though waiting for her command. Blake struggled, trying to fire his crossbow, but his body was frozen in place, every muscle seizing. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Blake? No." Ariel Mack's lips curled into a sadistic smile as she slowly approached. With a single word, she sent a bolt of black lightning into Blake's chest. The force of it shattered his body, turning him to ash in an instant. Mark could do nothing but watch, helpless and furious. "Now, it's your turn, hero," Ariel whispered, her voice dripping with venom. Mark, in a final act of defiance, roared and broke free of her bindings, charging at her with all the strength he had left. But the sorceress merely raised her hand, and with a flick of her fingers, Mark's body was destroyed. And so, Mark Mayeux and Blake Mata, heroes of legend, were no more. Their bodies lay among the stained ruins of the temple, and the cursed gold remained untouched. Preston Mayeux and the Quest for Vengeance. Years passed, and the jungle of Zimbabwe continued to pulse with dark energy, its cursed whispers carried on the wind. Mark Mayeux's name had become a faded legend, lost to time, but his son, Preston Mayeux, had heard the stories of his father's valiant deeds, of the man who had fought to the very end to reclaim his family's honor. Preston had been a child when his father died, but he had grown up with a fire in his heart, a fire that could only be extinguished by one thing: vengeance. For his father's death, for Blake's death, and for the injustice Ariel Mack had wrought upon them both. Preston stood on the edge of the jungle now, staring at the same temple that had once been the site of his father's downfall. His hand gripped the hilt of his father's sword, its worn pommel a reminder of the man he once was. He had trained in secret, learning the ways of battle and sorcery from forgotten texts and ancient relics. He would face Ariel Mack and end the curse that had claimed his father's life. As he stepped to the jungle, the air seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the trees whispering warnings he would not heed. The baboons had long since faded from the temple's vicinity, their spirits bound to the jungle itself. But the sorceress remained. The closer Preston got, the more the memories of his father's legacy haunted him. He remembered Mark's steady hand, his unyielding resolve, and the way he had always spoken of honor, of protecting those who could not protect themselves. Preston vowed to carry that same legacy into the dark heart of the jungle and into the very lair of Ariel Mack. When he finally stood before the temple, the air crackled with magic. A shadow flickered from the corner of his vision. Ariel Mack. "Ah, the son of Mark Mayeux," the sorceress purred, her eyes narrowing. "I wondered when you would come. How noble of you to seek vengeance for your father. Too bad it will end the same way." Preston raised his father's sword, its blade gleaming in the dim light. "I'll make sure it ends differently," he said, his voice steady, a fierce determination burning in his chest. Ariel Mack laughed, the sound a cruel, echoing mockery. "We shall see." With a roar, Preston charged, the sword of his father raised high, ready to carve through the darkness and claim the vengeance that had long been overdue. The battle would be fierce, but this time, the sorceress would find that there was something far more dangerous than gold waiting in the heart of Zimbabwe, the fire of a son seeking justice. The jungle quivered with the weight of anticipation as Preston Mayeux and Ariel Mack locked eyes. The air thickened with dark energy, the oppressive weight of the sorceress's magic pressing down like 1,000 invisible hands. Preston's grip tightened on his father's sword. The legacy of Mark Mayeux surged through him. Every lesson, every battle, every sacrifice. Ariel's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You have the same fire in your eyes as your father. But fire cannot stand against darkness. You'll find that out soon enough." Without warning, she raised her hand, and tendrils of black energy shot toward Preston. With a swift motion, he parried the attack, the dark tendrils sizzling against his blade. The sword's edge, imbued with the remnants of his father's will, absorbed the magic, turning it into a surge of raw energy. The blast sent Ariel staggering back, but she recovered in an instant, her laughter echoing like a sinister chime. "You think you can defeat me with his old sword?" Ariel taunted, her eyes gleaming with wicked amusement. "Mark Mayeux was weak. You'll be no different." Preston's face was stone, his gaze unwavering. He had heard those words too many times, first from the baboons, then from the sorceress herself. But unlike his father, who had been caught off guard by the relentless tide of darkness, Preston had come prepared. He had studied her magic, learned to counter it, and above all, learned to harness his rage without letting it consume him. "You killed my father, and you took everything from me," Preston growled, his voice low and deadly. "But I'm not the boy I once was. This ends now." With that, he surged forward, his sword a streak of silver light in the murky shadows of the temple. Ariel raised a barrier of black energy to deflect his attack, but Preston's strength, tempered by years of suffering and training, shattered it with a single powerful strike. Ariel's eyes widened in surprise. Impossible. She barely had time to react as Preston pressed his advantage, striking again and again, each blow landing with precision and fury. The sorceress, though powerful, was now on the defensive, her dark magic sputtering in desperation. With every strike, Preston pushed her further back, his father's blade cutting through the air like a force of nature. "You're not just fighting me," Preston spat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're fighting my family's legacy, my blood." Ariel snarled, her hands crackling with dark energy. "I will not be undone by the son of a fool." She unleashed a wave of black lightning, but Preston anticipated the move. He ducked and rolled, rising to his feet with a fluid grace, his sword in motion before Ariel could react. He struck her in the side, the sword cutting through her dark robes and drawing blood. For the first time, Ariel winced in pain, her eyes flickering with a hint of fear. "No more games," Preston said, his voice steady as steel. "It's over." With a final guttural cry, Ariel Mack tried to summon her last reserve of power, but Preston was faster. He lunged forward, his sword cleaving through the air and landing squarely in her chest. The sorceress gasped, her body jerking in pain as her magic unraveled. Her lifeless form crumpled to the ground, a shadow of the tyrant she had once been. Preston stood over her, panting heavily, the sword of his father now drenched in her dark blood. The jungle around him fell silent, as if acknowledging the end of a long and bloody chapter. As he looked down at the lifeless form of Ariel Mack, Preston allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. His father's death had haunted him for years, a shadow that loomed over every step he took. But now, in the stillness of the temple, with the cold weight of vengeance settled in his chest, there was only peace. He knelt beside his father's sword, the blade once more free of the curse that had bound it. Holding it up to the moonlight, Preston whispered a vow. "This is for you, Father." The winds of Zimbabwe seemed to shift, the jungle that had once been cursed now seeming to breathe a little easier. The ancient temple, where so much blood had been spilled, stood quiet and unmoving, its secrets finally buried with Ariel Mack. And in the end, Preston Mayeux had not only avenged his father, he had claimed his own place in the legend.